The first thing I heard wasn't my daughter yelling. It was the sharp crack of my dinner plate hitting the stone patio. Then came Brandon's laugh. "It's just food." Nobody moved. The smell of grilled ribeye still hung in the warm June air as my steak slid across the concrete, leaving a trail of juices and pepper seasoning behind. A fork spun in a slow circle before finally falling flat. Without saying a word, I reached down, picked up the brand new iPhone Brandon had left beside his drink, walked over to the edge of my swimming pool, and let it slip from my hand. It disappeared with one clean splash. "It's just a phone." That's when my daughter completely lost it. If you'd asked me 10 years earlier whether I'd ever throw someone's phone into a pool, I'd have laughed. That just wasn't me. I was the guy who fixed broken things, not the guy who broke them. My name's David Carter. I'm 61 years old, and I spent 38 years keeping UPS delivery trucks running across central Indiana. I retired 2 years ago with aching knees, one hearing aid, and enough grease permanently worked into my hands that I don't think it'll ever come out. I live in Carmel, just north of Indianapolis, in the same brick ranch my wife and I bought back in 1989. She picked the maple tree in the backyard. I built the deck myself. The swimming pool came years later after I worked every Saturday for nearly 18 months doing side jobs. Nothing about that house came easy. Maybe that's why I never took it for granted. After my wife Susan passed away from pancreatic cancer 4 years earlier, Sunday barbecues became my way of holding on to what was left of our family. Every Sunday around 4, same backyard, same grill, same folding table I'd refinish 3 different times. I still use Susan's steak seasoning recipe. She'd written it on an old index card with faded blue ink. A little garlic, black pepper, smoked paprika, a touch of brown sugar. Every time the fat hit the hot charcoal and started sizzling, I'd remember Father's Days when she'd stand beside me stealing bites before dinner. Those memories hurt, but they also kept her close. Our daughter Emily almost never missed a Sunday dinner. She was 34 now, a pediatric nurse at Riley Hospital, smart, kind, or at least she used to be. Somewhere along the way, she got tired of standing between her husband and me. Brandon Hayes, 36, luxury real estate agent, perfect white smile, designer sunglasses even when clouds covered the sun, always talking about investments, networking, market trends, and high-value people. He drove a leased BMW that probably cost more each month than my first mortgage payment. I honestly didn't care about any of that. What bothered me was the way he looked at people who had less, especially older people. He never insulted me directly. He didn't have to. He preferred little comments. "Dave, you still using that flip phone? You know they make hearing aids with Bluetooth now. That truck of yours belongs in a museum." Everyone would chuckle politely. Emily would squeeze my arm afterward. "Dad, he's joking." Maybe. But jokes stop being funny when they're always aimed in the same direction. I let it slide because I love my daughter. And because I'd promised Susan during her last weeks that I'd never let bitterness tear the family apart. Looking back, I kept that promise longer than I should have. That Sunday had started beautifully. Indiana weather finally felt like summer. The Cardinals were everywhere. My old country station played softly from a radio in the garage. I had 4 ribeyes resting under foil while the baked potatoes finished on the grill. Emily brought potato salad. Brandon showed up 20 minutes late carrying nothing except an expensive bottle of sparkling water he'd bought for himself. He glanced at the steaks. "You still buying Prime? That's a pretty expensive habit for retirement." I smiled. "Some things are worth spending money on." He laughed. "I guess." I ignored it. We all sat down. Emily talked about one of her young patients finally going home after months in the hospital. I listened, asked questions. It reminded me of the woman she'd become before life got so complicated. Then Brandon looked at my plate. "That's a pretty big steak." I grinned. "I've earned it." He reached across the table. At first, I thought he wanted the barbecue sauce. Instead, his forearm swept straight across my plate. The steak, the baked potato, the corn, everything. It crashed onto the patio. He looked down for half a second, then shrugged. "At your age," he said with a smirk, "maybe skipping a steak isn't such a bad thing." Nobody laughed. Not this time. Emily stared at him. His parents looked uncomfortable. Even the grandkids stopped talking. I slowly pushed my chair back. My knees protested as I stood. For one strange second, I actually considered apologizing. Isn't that ridiculous? Someone else humiliated me. And my first instinct was to make everyone else comfortable. Years of keeping the peace will do that to a person. Then I noticed Brandon setting his phone beside his glass while he reached for another burger. Brand new iPhone. Probably worth over $1,000. I walked over, picked it up. He frowned. What are you doing? I didn't answer. I took 6 slow steps toward the pool. Emily finally realized what was happening. Dad! Splash. The phone disappeared into 8 feet of water. I turned around. It's just a phone. Silence. Then Emily exploded. Dad, are you serious? Brandon sprinted toward the pool, shouting words I won't repeat. He kicked off his shoes and stared into the water, like somehow yelling would make the phone float back up. His mother gasped. His father rubbed his forehead. I looked at my ruined dinner lying on the patio. Then I looked at Emily. Not once. Not once. Had she asked whether I was okay? Not after Brandon embarrassed me. Not after years of little insults. The only thing she cared about was the phone. That hurt more than losing my temper. I grabbed my truck keys from the kitchen counter. Nobody tried to stop me. As I backed my old F-150 down the driveway, I caught one last glimpse in the mirror. Brandon was still pacing around the pool. Emily was crying. I should have felt guilty. Instead, I felt tired. Really tired. The kind of tired that has nothing to do with age. About 20 minutes later, I was halfway home on Keystone Parkway when my phone rang through the truck speakers. Emily. I almost didn't answer. Instead, it went to voicemail. Her voice was shaking. Dad, you have no idea what you've just started. I listened to it twice before pulling into my driveway. For the first time since Susan died, I had the feeling my family was about to change forever. For 2 days after that barbecue, nobody came by. Nobody checked on me. Nobody asked if I had eaten dinner after mine ended up on the patio. I got 3 text messages from Emily, all about Brandon's phone. Not one of them had the words, "Are you okay?" That told me more than I wanted to know. The first message came Sunday night. Asterisk, asterisk. You need to replace his phone. Asterisk, asterisk. The second came Monday morning. Asterisk, asterisk, Dad, this is embarrassing. His parents saw everything. Asterisk, asterisk. The third came Monday afternoon. Asterisk, asterisk. Brandon says if you apologize and pay for the damage, we can move past this. Asterisk, asterisk. Move past this. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of black coffee going cold in front of me, reading those words over and over. The house was quiet in that particular way a house gets after you've lived in it with someone for decades and then suddenly you don't. The refrigerator hummed. The old wall clock ticked in the hallway. Outside, the wind lifted the edge of the grill cover and let it flap once against the deck rail. Susan used to hate that sound. David, she'd call from the living room, that cover's going to end up in Ohio if you don't tie it down. I almost smiled. Then I didn't. I looked across the kitchen at her empty chair. Still there. Same cushion. Same little scratch on the leg from when Emily was 8 and tried to drag it across the room by herself. I know some people clear things out after a spouse dies. They paint rooms, donate clothes, rearrange furniture. I couldn't do it. Maybe that made me sentimental. Maybe it made me stuck. All I knew was that every corner of that house still had Susan in it. The recipe box beside the stove, the bird calendar near the back door, the yellow mixing bowl she insisted was better than every expensive bowl Emily ever bought her. And now, somehow, my own family had made me feel like a guest in the place Susan and I had built together. By Tuesday morning, Facebook had done what Facebook does. A cousin in Fishers posted something about elderly people who can't control their temper. Brandon's mother shared a quote about forgiveness and maturity. One of Emily's friends commented, "Some people get mean when they get old." I stared at that one longer than the others. Mean? Was I mean? I didn't like that question. So I did what old mechanics do when emotions get too messy. I found something to fix. The latch on the garage cabinet had been sticking for months. I grabbed a screwdriver, sat on an old milk crate, and took the whole thing apart. My right knee throbbed every time I bent it. My hearing aid whistled when I leaned too close to the metal shelf. I dropped one tiny screw and spent 10 minutes looking for it under the workbench, muttering words Susan would have scolded me for using. But the whole time my mind kept replaying the same scene. The plate hitting the patio, Brandon laughing. Emily screaming at me. Not him. Me. Around 3 that afternoon, my neighbor Mike Hollander knocked on the open garage door. Mike's 70, retired from Duke Energy, and walks his beagle twice a day whether the dog wants to or not. He had been at the barbecue because I always invited him on Sundays. After Susan passed, he started showing up with store-bought pie and pretending he just happened to have extra. "You busy?" he asked. I held up the broken latch. "Trying to save a $7 cabinet part from retirement." He nodded like that made perfect sense. Mike stepped inside, hands in the pockets of his cargo shorts. He looked uncomfortable, which was unusual for him. The man could talk to a fence post for 20 minutes. "I've been thinking about Sunday," he said. "Haven't we all?" He gave me a small smile, then it faded. "That wasn't an accident, Dave." I stopped turning the screwdriver. "I know." "No," he said. "I mean, I saw it. Clear as day. Brandon looked right at your plate before he hit it." Something cold moved through my chest. It was one thing to suspect it. Another thing entirely to hear someone say it out loud. Mike glanced toward the driveway like he expected Brandon to pull in. I probably should have said something right then. I froze up. Whole thing happened fast. "People freeze," I said. "Yeah, well," he rubbed the back of his neck. "There's more." I set the screwdriver down. Mike took a breath. "Couple months ago, maybe March, I was walking Winston past your place. Brandon was out front with 2 men, younger guys, real estate types, I guess. They were laughing about something. I didn't catch all of it." He paused. "What did you catch?" Mike looked me in the eye. He said, "When the old man ends up in assisted living, that house is going to pay for my lake place." For a second, I thought I had misunderstood. My hearing isn't perfect. Sometimes certain words slide past me, especially if a room has background noise. But Mike was standing 3 feet away in a quiet garage. I heard every word. I laughed once. Not because it was funny, because my body didn't know what else to do. "My house?" Mike didn't answer. He didn't have to. I looked out past him toward the maple tree Susan had planted the year Emily was born. Its branches covered half the backyard now. My house. The one Susan and I paid for with overtime, coupons, secondhand furniture, and postponed vacations. The one where Emily learned to ride her bike in the driveway. The one where Susan took her last breath in our bedroom while I held her hand. Brandon had already turned it into a future transaction. That night, I didn't sleep much. I sat at the dining room table with an old photo album open in front of me. There was Emily at 6, missing 2 front teeth, holding up a Father's Day card covered in glitter. There she was at 16, rolling her eyes because I insisted on taking a picture before prom. There she was at 24, standing beside Susan in the backyard, both of them laughing at something I couldn't remember. Then came the newer photos. Emily and Brandon at Christmas. Emily and Brandon at Thanksgiving. Emily and Brandon in my kitchen, his arm around her waist, his smile big and polished. And there I was, usually off to the side, sometimes partly cut out, sometimes holding the camera. I ran my finger over Susan's face in one old picture and felt a lump rise in my throat. "Did I miss it?" I whispered. I don't know who I was asking. Susan. God. Myself. Maybe all 3. Had I been so afraid of losing Emily that I let myself become smaller and smaller in my own family? I thought about calling her again. I even picked up the phone. My thumb hovered over her name. Then I remembered her voicemail. "You have no idea what you've just started." She was right. I didn't, but I was beginning to. So I put the phone down. I closed the photo album. And for the first time in years, I made a decision that had nothing to do with keeping everyone else comfortable. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to post anything online or trade insults with Brandon's family. I was going to pay attention. Quietly. carefully. Because if Brandon thought age made a man harmless, he had mistaken silence for weakness. And that was going to cost him. After my conversation with Mike, I stopped looking at Brandon the same way. Before, I'd seen him as an arrogant young man with expensive taste and lousy manners. Now I wondered if every smile, every favor, every compliment had been leading somewhere. That thought sat in the back of my mind for days. I didn't tell Emily what Mike had said. I didn't confront Brandon. Instead, I went back to living my normal life. At least that's what it looked like from the outside. Inside, I was watching. The first thing I noticed was how often Emily suddenly wanted to talk about my future. Not our future. Mine. She stopped by one Thursday evening after work wearing blue scrubs and carrying 2 coffees. "I figured you could use company," she said. I smiled. I never turned down coffee. For almost half an hour, we talked like we used to. One of her patients had finally been discharged after months in the hospital. I showed her the tomatoes growing behind the garage. We laughed about the squirrel that kept stealing birdseed from my feeder. For a little while, it felt normal. Then she asked, "So, have you thought about downsizing?" I looked at her. "Downsizing? Yeah, I mean, this house is a lot for one person. It keeps me busy." She stirred her coffee without looking at me. "You've got stairs. Only to the basement. And your knees. They've been bad for 20 years. She nodded slowly. "I just worry." I smiled. "I appreciate that." She hesitated. "Do you still have the original deed?" There it was. Not loud. Not dramatic. "Just there," I answered casually. "Somewhere. You should probably organize that kind of paperwork." I probably should. She seemed disappointed that I wasn't giving more information. A few minutes later, she left. I stood on the porch watching her car disappear around the corner. Susan always said our daughter was a terrible liar. Turns out, she wasn't much better at hiding nervousness. The following Sunday, Brandon came over carrying a bottle of wine that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a week. "Thought we'd bring something nice," he said. That alone almost made me laugh. In 6 years of marriage, he'd never brought me anything except opinions. During dinner, he couldn't have been friendlier. He complimented the steaks, asked about my truck, even offered to mow my lawn. "I've got one of those zero-turn mowers now," he said. "Wouldn't take me 20 minutes. "I'm good," I answered. "You sure?" "I like mowing." He smiled. "Well, if you ever need help around the house, I'll let you know." He nodded. But I caught the look he exchanged with Emily. Quick, subtle. The kind of glance married people share when a conversation doesn't go the way they expected. That bothered me more than the words. A week later, he tried again. This time, he showed up while I was changing the oil in my truck. "You still doing this yourself?" he asked. "I enjoy it. You know, if you ever wanted to simplify life, selling this place wouldn't be a bad move." I kept working. "Really? Houses in Carmel are bringing crazy money." "So I've heard. You could buy a condo in Florida." "I'm not a beach guy." He laughed. "Well, you won't want to maintain this place forever." I finally looked up. "Brandon." "Yeah? I've lived here 37 years. "Right. If I decide I don't want it anymore, I'll tell you." His smile stiffened. "Fair enough." He left 5 minutes later. That conversation stayed with me. Not because it was threatening, because it felt rehearsed. Like he'd practiced it. The following Tuesday, I had an appointment with my attorney, Richard Holloway. Richard wasn't just my lawyer. He'd handled Susan's estate after she died. He'd helped us refinance the house back in the 90s. He even played golf with me once before we both admitted neither of us was very good. I originally went there to update a beneficiary form on one of my retirement accounts. Nothing unusual. Richard finished reviewing the paperwork, slid the folder toward me, then leaned back in his chair. "You know," he said, "I've been debating whether to tell you something." My stomach tightened. "What is it?" He folded his hands. "Your son-in-law called my office a few months ago." I frowned. "About what?" He didn't ask about your file specifically. Richard chose his words carefully. He asked general questions. "What kind of questions?" The kind people ask when they're curious about elderly parents. I didn't say anything. Richard continued. He wanted to know how conservatorships work. I stared at him. He asked what happens when an older homeowner becomes unable to manage finances. Another pause. He also asked whether moving into assisted living changes ownership of someone's house. I felt my jaw tighten. What did you tell him? The only thing I legally could. Richard smiled slightly. Nothing. He shrugged. I explained that I couldn't discuss any matter involving a current client. Did he mention me? No, but he didn't have to. Silence settled between us. Finally, Richard spoke again. David. I know. I don't like assuming the worst about families. Neither do I. But those aren't ordinary questions. No, they aren't. I drove home much slower than usual. Not because traffic was bad, because every mile seemed to erase another excuse I'd made for Brandon over the years. Maybe he didn't mean it. Maybe he was joking. Maybe Emily would handle it. Maybe I was too sensitive. One by one, those maybes disappeared. That evening, I went out to my garage. It had always been my favorite room in the house. Tools hung exactly where I wanted them. Old license plates decorated one wall. Susan used to joke that I loved the garage more than the living room. Maybe she wasn't wrong. On the workbench sat a framed photograph of us from our 25th anniversary. She was laughing because I'd burned the first batch of burgers. I picked up the picture, ran my thumb across the glass. They think getting older means getting easier to push around, I said quietly. The garage answered with silence. But somehow, I felt like Susan understood. The next morning, I called Richard before 8. I'd like to make a few changes. What kind of changes? The kind that makes sure nobody mistakes kindness for permission. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'll clear my afternoon. By noon, I had another appointment. This one wasn't about reacting to Brandon. It was about protecting the life Susan and I had spent nearly 4 decades building. For the first time since that barbecue, I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about peace. And sometimes, peace begins with paperwork. The paperwork took less time than I expected. The peace it gave me took a little longer. Over the next 3 weeks, I met with Richard twice and an estate planner once. We went over everything. My house, my retirement accounts, my truck, even the old fishing boat I'd barely used since Susan got sick. Richard never once asked if I wanted revenge. He asked a better question. What outcome would let you sleep at night? I thought about that for a long moment. I don't want to punish anybody, I finally said. I just don't ever want someone thinking they can plan my life without asking me. He nodded. That's a healthy goal. So that's exactly what we did. We created a trust, named an independent trustee, updated my medical directives, made it crystal clear that no one, not family, not anyone, could step in and make decisions simply because they thought they knew what was best for me. Everything was legal, simple, quiet. No dramatic courtroom scenes. No secret recordings. No traps. Just grown-up decisions made by a man who had finally realized protecting himself wasn't selfish. It was necessary. Oddly enough, once those papers were signed, I stopped thinking about Brandon every day. For the first time in months, my world became bigger than him. One Saturday morning, Mike stopped by with 2 cups of coffee. You busy? Not unless staring at weeds counts. He laughed. You still got that '68 Mustang? I looked toward the detached garage. It still needs work. There's a classic car meet next weekend. I haven't gone to one in years. So, he shrugged. Maybe it's time. I almost said no. Then I remembered something Susan used to tell me whenever I'd spend too much time fixing everybody else's problems. You deserve hobbies too, David. The following Saturday, Mike and I drove 30 minutes to Noblesville. The parking lot was full of old Chevys, Fords, Pontiacs, and more stories than cars. Men my age stood around drinking coffee and arguing over carburetors like they were debating world politics. Nobody cared what kind of phone you owned. Nobody cared how expensive your watch was. One gray-haired man spent 15 minutes telling me how he'd rebuilt a 1967 Camaro with his grandson. Another invited me to stop by his garage anytime. Driving home that afternoon, I realized something. I'd laughed more in 4 hours than I had in the previous 4 months. The next week, I volunteered at a nonprofit garage that repaired donated vehicles for military veterans trying to get back on their feet. It wasn't glamorous. Mostly brakes, oil changes, alternators, sometimes transmissions. I came home dirty every Thursday and happier than I'd been in years. Funny how helping strangers reminded me I still had something worthwhile to offer. A month after the barbecue, Emily called. "Dad?" "Hi, sweetheart." "Where have you been?" I smiled to myself. "Out." "You've been hard to reach." "I've been busy." "Doing what?" "A little fishing, a little volunteering." There was a pause. "You never told me." "You never asked." Silence. Then she quietly said, "I stopped by Sunday." "I know." I'd found a small container of homemade cookies sitting by my front door. No note. Just cookies. "I thought maybe we could have dinner." "I already had plans." "You've never had plans on Sunday." "I do now." Another silence. It wasn't angry. It was unfamiliar. For years, I'd organized my life around everyone else's schedule. Now, suddenly, they had to fit into mine. Emily wasn't used to that. Neither was I. One evening, after finishing dinner, I sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. Without really planning to, I started writing a letter to Emily. Not an angry letter. Not a legal explanation. Just the truth. I wrote about Susan. About how scared I'd been after losing her. About why I'd kept saying yes every time Brandon crossed another line. I admitted that I was afraid if I stood up for myself, I'd lose my daughter too. Then I wrote something that surprised even me. Asterisk, asterisk. I don't need you to choose between your husband and your father. I only needed you to notice when someone treated your father like he didn't matter. Dot asterisk, asterisk. I stared at that sentence for a long time. It hurt because it was true. I folded the letter, slipped it into an envelope, wrote Emily's name across the front. Then, I put it in the top drawer of my desk. She wasn't ready to read it. Maybe I wasn't ready to send it. Not yet. A few days later, Mike came over while I was washing my truck. "You hear?" "Hear what?" "Your son-in-law's been telling people you're acting strange." I laughed. "That's new?" Mike grinned. "No, but this part is." He leaned against the fence. "Apparently he's organizing some kind of family meeting." I kept spraying soap across the driver's door. "For what?" "To clear the air." I shook my head. "Sounds thoughtful." Mike snorted. "You don't believe that?" "No." Neither of us did. 2 nights later, Emily called again. Her voice sounded careful. "Brandon wants everyone to get together next Saturday." I figured. He says we need to settle everything. I rinsed the truck in silence. "Dad?" "I'm listening." "Will you come?" I looked across my backyard. The maple tree Susan planted was casting a long evening shadow across the lawn. The pool water reflected the orange sky. For the first time in years, I didn't feel trapped. I wasn't walking into that meeting to defend myself. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going there to convince anyone I deserved respect. That part was over. "I'll be there," I said calmly. Emily sounded relieved. "Thank you." After we hung up, I called Richard. "I think it's time." He didn't ask what I meant. "I'll meet you there," he replied. I put the phone down and smiled. Not because I was looking forward to embarrassing Brandon, because for the first time in a long while, I wasn't afraid of what came next. Whatever happened at that family meeting, I already had my life back. Brandon just didn't know it yet. Saturday afternoon arrived warm and clear. The kind of Indiana summer day that usually called for burgers on the grill and kids running through sprinklers. Instead, I was driving toward my daughter's house with my attorney following behind me in his silver Lexus. I wasn't nervous. That surprised me. A month earlier, I would have spent the whole drive rehearsing arguments in my head. Now, I had nothing left to prove. Richard parked beside me and stepped out, carrying a slim leather briefcase. "You ready?" he asked. "As ready as I'll ever be." He smiled. Remember, you're not here to fight. I know. We're just telling the truth. I nodded. Sometimes the truth is more uncomfortable than any argument. Emily and Brandon lived in a large two-story house on the west side of Carmel. Ironically, Brandon loved telling people it was his dream home. What he usually forgot to mention was that the bank technically owned most of it. When we walked through the front door, everyone was already there. Emily, Brandon, his parents, my sister Carol, my nephew Jason. Even Mike had been invited after Brandon heard he'd witnessed what happened at the barbecue. The room went quiet. Brandon noticed Richard almost immediately. He laughed. You seriously brought a lawyer? I smiled politely. I brought someone who's very good with paperwork. His grin widened. Wow, that's dramatic. Richard simply introduced himself and shook everyone's hand. Professional. Calm. Exactly why I'd asked him to come. Emily looked confused. Dad, what's going on? I think Brandon wanted to clear the air. I do, Brandon interrupted. He stood near the fireplace with his hands in his pockets like he was hosting a business meeting. We've all been uncomfortable since the phone incident. Nobody answered. He looked around the room. I think David owes everyone an apology. David. Not Dad. Not Mr. Carter. David. Funny how respect often disappears one word at a time. He continued. What happened was completely unacceptable. Richard glanced at me. I gave him a small nod. He opened his briefcase. Brandon frowned. What exactly is this? Richard spoke in the same calm voice I'd heard in his office dozens of times. Mr. Carter asked me to attend because several misunderstandings have developed regarding his estate and future plans. Brandon laughed again. What estate? Richard ignored him. Over the past several weeks, we've completed a comprehensive estate plan. Emily blinked. You did? Yes. I didn't know. I know. Richard continued. A revocable trust has been established. He slid a folder onto the coffee table. Medical directives have been updated. Another folder. Durable powers of attorney have been revised. One more folder. And an independent trustee has been appointed. The room became very quiet. Brandon crossed his arms. So, Richard said pleasantly, Mr. Carter's wishes are now legally documented. Brandon shrugged. I don't understand why we're talking about this. Richard looked directly at him. I think you do. For the first time all afternoon, Brandon stopped smiling. Richard folded his hands. A few months ago, someone contacted my office asking general questions. Emily looked at him. What kind of questions? Richard answered without looking away from Brandon. Questions about conservatorships. Silence. Questions about elderly homeowners losing financial control. Emily's forehead wrinkled. What? Questions about what happens when someone enters assisted living. Brandon quickly spoke. Those were hypothetical. Richard nodded. They were. I was just curious. I'm sure you were. Emily turned toward her husband. You called Dad's attorney? Brandon hesitated. I mean, you did? I wasn't asking about your father specifically. Richard spoke gently. You didn't need to. The room felt smaller by the second. Brandon rubbed the back of his neck. I work in real estate. So do thousands of people, Richard replied. They don't usually call their father-in-law's attorney asking how older homeowners lose control of their assets. Nobody said a word. Brandon's father slowly looked down at the floor. His mother folded her hands tightly in her lap. Emily stared at her husband as if she'd never seen him before. Finally, she whispered, Why? Brandon sighed loudly. You're making this sound worse than it was. Worse? Emily's voice cracked. Worse? He threw his hands into the air. I was trying to plan ahead. For what? Our future. Emily took one slow step backward. My father's future isn't your financial plan. Nobody breathed. Brandon looked around the room searching for support. He didn't find any. Not from his parents. Not from my sister. Not even from Jason. Mike quietly cleared his throat. I saw what happened with the steak. Every head turned toward him. It wasn't an accident. Brandon immediately answered. That's ridiculous. Mike didn't raise his voice. I've known David for 25 years. He looked Brandon squarely in the eye. You looked right at his plate before you knocked it onto the patio. Another long silence. Then Mike added, and I heard what you said back in March. Brandon's face drained of color. You remember that? When the old man ends up in assisted living, that house will pay for my lake place. Nobody moved. Emily slowly turned back toward her husband. You said that? It was a joke. No. Her voice was barely above a whisper. It wasn't. For several seconds, the only sound in the room was the ceiling fan. Brandon tried one last time. Everybody's blowing this out of proportion. I finally stood. Not because I was angry, because I wanted everyone to hear me clearly. I didn't come here to embarrass you. My voice stayed calm. I came because I spent almost 40 years building a home with my wife. I looked toward Emily. I wanted my retirement to be about fishing, working on old cars, having dinner with my daughter. I paused. Instead, I found myself wondering whether I needed to protect my own front door. Nobody interrupted. I never cared about the phone. I looked at Brandon. I cared that you thought humiliating me was funny. Then I looked at everyone else. And I cared even more that I started believing keeping the peace meant accepting disrespect. I shook my head. I was wrong. The room stayed completely silent. Not awkward, not tense, just honest. Richard quietly closed his briefcase. I believe our work here is finished. No one tried to stop us as we walked toward the front door. Just before I reached it, Emily spoke. Dad! I turned. She looked like she wanted to say 100 different things. None of them came out. Instead, she simply started crying. I gave her a small, sad smile. Then Richard and I walked outside. As I climbed into my truck, he looked over and asked, How do you feel? I started the engine. Lighter. He nodded. That's usually what happens when people stop carrying things that were never theirs to carry. I drove home with the windows down. For the first time in a very long while, I wasn't driving away from my family. I was driving back toward myself. Life didn't magically become peaceful after that meeting. Real life rarely works that way. The next morning, I still woke up at 6. My knees still hurt climbing out of bed. The coffee still tasted better from the old mug Susan bought me at a roadside diner 20 years ago. And when I looked across the kitchen, her chair was still empty. Some things don't change because you win an argument. 3 days passed before Emily called. I watched my phone ring. Let it go to voicemail. Not because I wanted to punish her, because I honestly didn't know what to say yet. Her message was short. Dad, can we talk? I listened to it twice. Then I went outside and mowed the lawn instead. About a week later, she knocked on my front door. She looked exhausted. Dark circles under her eyes. Hair tied back in a hurry. No makeup. She reminded me of the little girl who used to come home after losing a softball game, trying very hard not to cry. Can I come in? Of course. I made coffee. She sat in Susan's chair before realizing what she'd done. I'm sorry. It's okay. Neither of us touched the coffee for almost 5 minutes. Finally, she spoke. I didn't know. I nodded. I believe you. She looked relieved. But, she continued, I also know that's not the whole story. I waited. She stared into her coffee. I saw him make jokes. Another pause. I heard little comments. She swallowed. I just kept telling myself they weren't important. They weren't, I said softly. Not by themselves. She looked up. But together, they became something else. Tears filled her eyes. I should have stopped him years ago. I reached across the table and rested my hand over hers. You loved your husband. I still do. I know. And I love you. I know that too. She cried quietly. Not dramatic sobbing. Just the kind of crying that comes after holding something inside for too long. When she finally left, she hugged me tighter than she had in years. I thought maybe we were finally heading in the right direction. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, she came back. This time, she was angry. Not at me, at the situation. I talked to Brandon, and he says everyone turned against him. I nodded. He says Mike exaggerated. I see. He says your lawyer humiliated him. I didn't answer. Then she asked the question she'd really come to ask. Can't we all just move on? I looked at her for a long moment. Then I walked over to the desk in my living room, opened the top drawer, pulled out the envelope I'd written weeks earlier. I wrote this for you. She reached for it. I gently pulled it back. Not yet. She looked confused. Dad? I don't think you're ready. Her face fell. What do you mean? I think you're still trying to fix everyone's pain except your own. Silence. I'll always love you, Emily. I know. But I'm not going to pretend everything's okay just because pretending feels easier. She wiped her eyes. I don't know what to do. I smiled sadly. You don't have to figure it out today. She hugged me before leaving. Neither of us mentioned Brandon again. Another month went by. Summer slowly drifted toward fall. The maple tree in the backyard began turning red around the edges. Thursday mornings still belonged to the veterans' garage. Saturday afternoons usually meant coffee with Mike or a classic car show somewhere around Indianapolis. For the first time since Susan died, I wasn't just passing time. I was living again. Then one cool September afternoon, Emily knocked on my door for the third time. She was alone. She looked different, calmer, older somehow. She sat down without saying a word. After nearly a minute, she whispered, I moved out. I didn't ask for details. She continued anyway. I finally asked him one question. I waited. I asked him if he would have treated you the same way if Mom were still alive. She smiled sadly. He couldn't answer. I closed my eyes for a second. She took a deep breath. I spent years telling myself I was keeping the peace. She looked at me. But all I was really doing was asking you to carry all the hurt. Neither of us spoke. Then she surprised me. She stood up, walked into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, pulled out 2 steaks. I stopped by the butcher on the way here. I laughed. You planning dinner? If you'll let me help? For the first time since Susan died, someone stood beside me at the grill instead of waiting to be served. The charcoal crackled. Fat dripped onto the coals. The familiar smell filled the backyard. Emily reached for the seasoning. The garlic goes first, right? I smiled. Your mother would have been proud you remembered. She laughed through tears. I finally understand why these Sundays mattered so much. So do I. When dinner was ready, she carried my plate to the table herself. She set it down carefully, looked me in the eye, and smiled. Don't let yours get cold, Dad. I don't think she realized how much those 6 words meant. Months earlier, someone had knocked my dinner onto the ground. Now, my daughter was making sure I had a hot meal in front of me. No speeches. No grand gestures. Just respect. Sometimes that's enough. Brandon and Emily divorced quietly the following spring. There wasn't some dramatic courtroom showdown. No shouting. No celebration. Honestly, I felt more sadness than satisfaction. No father dreams of seeing his daughter's marriage end. But I also knew something had finally become impossible to ignore. A marriage can't survive if respect only travels in one direction. These days, Sunday dinners still happen. The guest list is smaller. Sometimes it's just Emily and me. Sometimes Mike joins us. Every once in a while, a couple of the veterans from the garage stop by after church. The table isn't as full as it used to be, but the conversations are better. The laughter is real, and nobody has to walk on eggshells anymore. Every now and then, I'll catch myself looking toward the deep end of the pool. The phone has been gone for months. What stayed with me wasn't that moment. It was everything that came after. I used to believe protecting my family meant accepting whatever they handed me. I don't believe that anymore. Growing older doesn't mean becoming less valuable. It simply means you've had enough years to recognize the difference between love and obligation. And once you know that difference, life gets a whole lot lighter. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your self-respect, I hope you know you're not alone. Thank you for listening to my story. Take good care of yourself, and never forget that kindness and healthy boundaries can exist side by side.